A young woman got breast cancer at 19. By 24, she was going through menopause at the same time as her mum. Not as a metaphor, as a literal medical reality. That story is in this episode, and it reframes what we mean when we say menopause in a way that I think is worth sitting with for a minute.
Hi there, I'm Tony Lee, and this is Hot Flasher, your daily menopause podcast that serves up fresh news, research, and wellness tips. I've built a daily news pipeline to find the latest on women's health and menopause research. Allow me to introduce my co-host, Nikki, who handles the headlines. Take it away, Nikki.
Thanks, Tony. We've got a genuinely interesting mix today. Let's get into it. There's a story from Business Insider this week about a 24-year-old woman named Mia, who was diagnosed with breast cancer at 19. She went through chemotherapy, and as a result of her treatment, she entered menopause at 24. And here's the detail that stopped me. She and her mother are going through menopause at the same time. That's not a metaphor. That's two women in the same house, same season of life in the most unexpected way, navigating hot flashes and hormonal upheaval together. One of them because of natural aging, one of them because cancer treatment shut down her ovarian function in her late teens. Medically induced menopause, sometimes called iatrogenic menopause, can happen from chemotherapy, radiation to the pelvic area, or surgical removal of the ovaries. In Mia's case, chemo. The hormonal result is the same as natural menopause. Estrogen drops, FSH climbs, symptoms arrive. But the context is completely different. She doesn't have decades of perimenopause to ease into this. She went from teenager to menopausal in years, not a gradual transition. And the resources aren't built for her. The clinical literature, the patient communities, the menopause apps, they're oriented toward women in their late 40s and 50s. When you're 24 and searching for information about bone density loss, vaginal dryness, or whether you can have children after this, you are working against a system that genuinely wasn't designed with you in mind. Fertility preservation before chemotherapy is something oncologists are increasingly discussing with young female patients. But it's not universal. And post-treatment, the long-term care piece, managing symptoms, managing cardiovascular and bone health through potentially decades of lowered estrogen, that's a clinical conversation that needs more infrastructure than it currently has. The emotional layer of this story is real, and I'm not going to flatten it. There's something both painful and oddly connecting about sharing this experience with your mother. But what I want the medical system to hear is the practical gap. Young women with cancer treatment-induced menopause need specialised care pathways. And see your gynecologist isn't sufficient when most gynecologists are also unprepared for this specific situation. Which actually brings me to something that came out of the NAMS journal this week, the Journal of the North American Menopause Society. And it's about nocturia. That's the clinical term for waking at night to urinate. One time or more, per night. If you are raising your hand right now, you are not alone. This is one of the most common complaints in postmenopausal women, and it's also one of the most underrated in terms of how much it wrecks quality of life. You can't get adequate sleep if you're getting up twice a night. You just can't. And yet, this symptom doesn't always get the focused clinical attention it deserves. The NAMS piece, published in the journal Menopause, frames this as a practice pearl, meaning it's written for clinicians, laying out the multifactorial picture of why postmenopausal women experience nocturia at higher rates. And the picture is more complicated than your bladder is weaker. It's actually several things converging. Estrogen decline affects the urethral and bladder tissue directly, part of what's sometimes called genitourinary syndrome of menopause, or GSM. The mucosa thins, the tissue becomes less elastic, the bladder's functional capacity can decrease. That's one layer, but there are also changes to how the kidneys handle fluid overnight. A shift in how antidiuretic hormone works means older adults and postmenopausal women specifically can produce more urine at night relative to the day. Add to that the sleep architecture disruption that menopause brings, where you're already in lighter sleep stages and more easily roused. And then there's the bladder overactivity component that estrogen decline contributes to. It's not one problem, it's 4 problems wearing the same coat. The reason this matters clinically is that treatment depends on which of those mechanisms is actually driving someone's nocturia. If it's primarily GSM, vaginal and urethral tissue changes, local estrogen therapy has a solid evidence base. If it's overactive bladder, that's a different conversation. If fluid redistribution is a big part of it, there are behavioural interventions, elevation of the legs in the evening, reducing fluids in the 2 hours before bed. That can help. This is the kind of nuanced, evidence-grounded differential that a 5-minute appointment doesn't accommodate. And this is exactly what a tool like open evidence is designed to support. The kind of clinical evidence synthesis that helps a doctor move past just get up and go, that's normal, to actually mapping the mechanism and choosing a targeted approach. My actual take here, if you are waking up 1 or more times a night to urinate and you've mentioned it to a doctor and they shrugged, push harder. Name it specifically. I have Nocturia. I've read it's associated with genitourinary syndrome of menopause. I'd like to discuss whether local estrogen therapy is appropriate for me. That framing forces a more substantive response than, I keep getting up at night. The third thing I want to cover is something USA Today ran this week, menopause legislation. There's a real policy movement happening in the US right now, and the piece does a good job of explaining what's actually in play without overpromising. So what does menopause legislation mean in practice? A few different things, depending on the bill. The proposals currently in various stages of the legislative process include requirements that insurance plans cover hormone replacement therapy without prior authorization barriers, mandates, or incentives for medical schools to include menopause training in the curriculum, and increased federal research funding specifically for menopause, particularly for conditions and symptoms that have been historically underfunded because they're women-specific. None of this is law yet as of this week. These are proposals, some at the federal level and some at the state level, and their progress varies, but the fact that there's a term, menopause legislation, that USA Today has to explain to its readers tells you something about how fast this conversation has accelerated. The thing I keep coming back to is the training gap, the statistic that gets cited constantly and that holds up when you look at the research. The average physician receives approximately 1 hour of menopause-specific education in medical school. 1 hour for a condition that affects half the population for potentially 30 or more years of their lives. Legislation that attaches requirements or funding to expanding that training isn't a fringe idea. It's a correction to something that was underfunded from the beginning. The insurance piece matters too. HRT coverage is genuinely inconsistent across plans. Some women are paying out of pocket for medications that have strong evidence behind them because their insurer treats it as optional or requires prior auth that makes it practically inaccessible. A policy framework that standardizes coverage is not a luxury for people navigating that. I'll be watching what actually moves through committee in the next few months. The advocacy energy around this has been building for a few years. The NAM's advocacy work, the Menopause Society's congressional briefings, the growing number of women in their 40s and 50s who are politically active and increasingly vocal about this specific gap in care. Whether that translates into signed legislation is a different question. But the conversation is no longer happening only in patient forums. It's on the floor.
Thanks for listening to Hot Flasher. We're back tomorrow with more, so don't forget to subscribe. See you tomorrow.